would like to, first of all, thank the organizers, in particular Gabriela Rangel, for inviting me, and also Miriam de Miguel and Alex Albero for thinking of me. It's an honor to be in this company. I feel somewhat out of place insofar as I'm not an art historian nor a specialist in Gego's work. And partly for this reason, I have decided, in all modesty, to limit myself today to a series of reflections on the posthumous notes known as Sabiduras. The name of these notes, as somebody in the audience was already pointing out, is obviously a neologism that plays on the Spanish Sabidurías, only now hardened or harshened into Sabiduras. Words of hard-fought wisdom, we might perhaps paraphrase. As a matter of fact, in them there is indeed talk not only of knowledge, reason or saber, but also of what it means to be wise, to achieve clarity of understanding and judgment by learning the rules of what Gego calls wise or judicious limitation. Gego, in other words, appears here as a kind of sage or a wise woman who reminds herself and shares with her readers and students some of the principles of her creative mastery. In terms of their form, these Sabiduras remind us of a long yet also minor tradition of aphoristic writing, all the way from the thoughts or pensées of Blaise Pascal to the posthumous and unfinished notes now gathered in the Nachlass of Friedrich Nietzsche, or from Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, minus, of course, the dogmatic systematicity, or his philosophical investigations, minus the logical tenor, all the way to the typical artist statements that in the modern periods begin to flow from the pens of poets and plastic artists alike. Here we can think, for example, of Stéphane Mallarmé, who in Divagation defines the act of poetry, or perhaps the act of art in general, as follows. The one available act forever and alone is to understand their relations, in the meantime few or many, according to some interior state that one wishes to extend in order to simplify the world. Or we may also think of Paul Klee's ubiquitous statement, and I'm slightly embarrassed to quote this because it appears on so many museum walls, but it would also reappear, in fact, alluded to in Gego's Sabiduras. Art does not reproduce the visible, rather it makes visible. My aim is always to get hold of the magic of reality and to transfer this reality into painting, to make the invisible visible through reality. It may sound paradoxical, but it is in fact reality which forms the mystery of our existence. I mention these names not because it is a question of influences, but rather of form. Or if it is a matter of influence, Celia before was mentioning how private Gego was about possible influences. But I would suggest that the lines may actually have to be drawn both ways or in both directions. With Nietzsche or Wittgenstein, for example, themselves being influenced not only by philosophical theses or by mathematical formula, but also by artistic statements constitutive of a modern sense of the avant-garde. I think it would be interesting to study the exchange between these different sort of discursive fields in terms of the form of the aphorism, as you can find it both in manifestos of the avant-garde and in some of the more formalized philosophical writings. At the most basic level, Gego's Sabiduras constitute statements of principles about the structure of what is. Insofar as they deal with such classical topics in the science of being, as the relations between the one and the many, the difference between nature and reality, or the real and the actual, these statements, in other words, offer us a glimpse into Gego's implicit ontology. The fundamental principle of this can be restated as follows. All there is are relations. Consider, for example, and appropriately enough, the first Sabidura. Relaciones de líneas creadas, ni de la realidad de ver, ni de la realidad de saber. Bild, das die Wirklichkeit auflöst, Imagen, que disuelve la realidad. In fact, maybe showing again this linguistic agrammaticality in the original Gego actually writes imagen que disolva la realidad, two S's. This first Sabidura provides us with what we might call the ontological bottom line. It involves making a declaration about what there is, or about being, and this in turn implies a secondary declaration about the difference between what there is, or the being of what there is, and that which is known or seen as reality, la realidad, or die Wirklichkeit. In sum, what there is are only relations and lines are nothing but the expression or indication of relations between points. Hegel's ontology, or to follow her own instinct for punning, her hegology, is one of strict immanence. There is only one substance which is relational through and through. At the beginning there was the relation, and in the end as well. We do not have first a set of objects and then secondarily a set of relations between them. To the contrary, objects are themselves nothing but assemblages of points and lines, that is, of relations. Immediately, however, we are struck by a certain ambiguity or vacillation, which has to do with the place of application of Hegel's statements about relationality. Are these statements about the being of the existing world, or about the world that is to be constructed through artistic means? Is this about being or sein, or something that must be, or sein müssen? After all, in Sabidura 1, Gego draws a clear distinction between the being of relations and what she calls the reality that we see and know. Just as in Sabidura 4, we are told that the line as an expression of relation does not exist materially in nature. We need to wait until Sabidura 5 to realize that the relations that make up the real, because they are different from reality, are to be constructed on the basis of prefabricated parts that together constitute an object or assemblage of relations. And these are very cryptic statements in which she doesn't really say the artwork is this or that, or the world is. Even grammatically, again, we have this weird construction. Construir hoy significa la relación entre partes para crear un objeto que ocupa espacio, which is rendered in English in a more fluent way. To construct nowadays means relating parts to each other in order to create an object that occupies space. Finally, Sabidura 10 reiterates the extent to which art is involved here, and art is convincing only where it actualizes reality as seen and known in modern science. La realidad nuclear, tal como es percibida por la ciencia moderna, todavía tiene que ser actualizada en el arte de manera convincente. In English they use updated. I think it would be better to talk about actualization, also in the sense of verwirklichen, realize or actualize. So I'm trying to point out a strange moment of a slight discrepancy or displacement, a minimal gap between the world as it exists, as a set of relations, and the set of relations that make up a work of art. How do we move from one to the other? Here, we notice that Hegel's affirmation of immanence, there are only relations, is not entirely homogeneous or univocal. If there is a minimal difference between the world of relations and reality as we see, perceive, or know it, then how can we maintain this difference without breaking with our principle of immanence, according to which all there is are relations? Gego must find a way to delimit a beyond from within the immanence of relationality. This is a challenge similar to the one facing Wittgenstein in the Tractatus, whose task also consists in delimiting the boundaries of sense or meaning without falling into pure nonsense or absurdity, or what he calls Unsinn. Insofar as meaning belongs to propositions about the world, there must be a way to show without saying the sense or meaning of the world as such. Gego formulates this conundrum in terms of the limits between the visible and the invisible, on the one hand, and the positing of something higher or greater, grosser, than the visible on earth. She makes a statement that goes as follows in Sabidura 12. The clear and well-defined forms that live around us are proof of the greatness of formations and creations beyond what is visible on earth. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that they signal to formations that are greater than that which is visible on earth. Many of you are familiar with one of the opening statements in the Tractatus, where Wittgenstein writes, everything that can be thought of at all can be thought of clearly. What can be said at all can be said clearly. And then the question immediately becomes, what lies just, not beyond, but at the upper limit of that which can be thought or stated clearly? That which is, in Gego's words, greater than what is visible on earth. Which is not the way the world is or how the world is, but rather the fact, which is always mysterious, that the world is. As Wittgenstein writes, how things are in the world is a matter of complete indifference for what is higher. God does not reveal himself in the world. But this understanding of a beyond or God is also not a transcendent entity. It is something that can be gestured at or indicated or shown from within the limits of the world as we know it. Another way of understanding this conundrum, the problem of forming something like an imminent break or a beyond without transcendence, would entail comparing two other statements that appear in Sabidura 12, each of them attributed to an ancient authority, the first to Aristotle and the second to Anaxagoras. These two statements, one, the whole is more than the sum of its parts, and the other, all is within all. These two statements are actually harder to reconcile than appears at first sight. Either all is within all, in a quasi-pantheistic homogeneity, or else there exists a point of excess, or a source of higher power of the whole over the mere sum of its parts. Here we are truly on the threshold between the visible and the invisible, with the task ahead consisting in the making visible of the invisible, and the metamorphosing or transforming of intuition into knowledge or wisdom. She says, and this is where the Paul Klee comes back, Sichtbar machen des Unsichtbaren, the making visible of the invisible, and the transformation of intuition into knowledge or wisdom, Wissen. Now before I turn to the place of the I or subject in this transition, I would like to turn very briefly to a Sabidura, namely number 11, that Nuit already mentioned, but focusing on different segments, that at first sight seems only related marginally to the debate so far. I am referring to the Sabidura that deals with language, or what Gego refers to as sprachliches. That's a weird sort of expression, the linguistic. In English, translated as linguisticisms. Lacan perhaps would have talked about linguisterie, or la langue, or language. And what we witness here, through the free reins given to morphological wordplay and puns, the wit that a member of the audience mentioned before, reminiscent of Freud's Witz, is the becoming autonomous of language as such. And I'll give one of the examples. Fortschritt, Rückschritt, and this is untranslatable. Einschritt, Einschreiten, and so forth. So she basically plays with the breaking up of the morphological structure of the word and then invents or lists paradigmatically all the other options, all the way to the eschatological joke or pun on Schritt halten, Schritt machen, Schrittmacher, Schrittmacher, Schrittschritt, Schrittschreit zum Himmel, zur Hölle, Fortschritt, and then Fortschritt. Mixing the languages, as Nuit was already pointing out. What is happening here technically can be described in terms of what the linguist Roman Jakobson describes as the essence of the poetic function of language, namely, and I quote, the projection of the principle of equivalence from the axis of selection onto the axis of combination. Translated into pedestrian language, for Jakobson there are two axes, the horizontal and the vertical, and so we speak obviously with the concatenation of signs that are put together, if you want, horizontally. But for every choice of a phoneme or a morpheme or a word or a sentence, there are alternative choices. So we can move from Fortschritt to Rückschritt, and we can simply have a column of possibilities of words, similar with cat, fat, rat, mat, and so on. What happens in poetry, according to Jacobson, is that this virtual, vertical column of options that need to be selected and some of them excluded in order to make one chain of the actually selected elements is projected onto and realized into actuality. So you get actually the richness of hidden language. All the possibilities, including puns, are projected onto the actual statement. And so I think it's very well possible that exile, for example, is an important factor in this game. Also awareness of alternative ways of hearing sounds like Fortschritt, and it sounds like Fort, like Fordism, Fortschritt, progress through Fort, organization of labor. But at the same time, it is a strictly linguistic operation that produces a self-reflexive autonomy within language. Language projecting itself into its own autonomous structure. In the tradition of Spanish poetic language, we can find a strong equivalent for Gego's play on the autonomy of language in the long poem Altazor by the creationist Vicente Huidobro. Huidobro is the founder and sole member of a movement that he called creacionismo, creationism. One of the first avant-garde poetic movements in Latin America. In Altazor, which was published only in 1931, but which is chronologically situated in the early 1920s, he writes, se acerca a todo galope, ya viene la golondrina, ya viene la golonfina, ya viene la golondrina, ya viene la goloncima, viene la golonchina, viene la golonclima, ya viene la golonrima, ya viene la golonrisa, la goloniña, la golonlira, and it goes on and on and on, like a machine that basically derails, and it's pure language that spills out by actualizing the entire virtual realm of possible options that are now not excluded, but in fact all actualized. Or again, about the nightingale, el rossignol, pero el cielo prefiere el rodoñol, su niño querido el roreñol, su flor de alegría el romiñol, su piel de lágrima el rofañol, su garganta nocturna el rosolñol, el rolañol, el rosiñol. So when you come to the last verse, you realize what the logic of this whole, if you want, deconstruction and reconstruction of language was, namely the breakdown of the morphological structure of this term rosignol, in which the sound of the note of solfège is then punned on to produce do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. Compare this to the solution of our conundrum regarding the imminent break in Gego's Sabiduras. The point here is not simply to find an intuition or an intuitive way of becoming one with the whole world of relationality. We must also articulate and bridge the gap between the world as we know or perceive it, including the world of language as we speak it, and the autonomous assemblage of points and lines or words and statements into objects in space. So if we consider this similar to, let's say, the structure of the chorros that Monica talked about, then the question is, how do we bridge the affirmation that all there is in the world is the chance-like concatenation of lines and relations? How do we bridge that realization with the autonomy of the artistic construction? Because this transition or articulation is far from being spontaneous or intuitive, Gego's Sabiduras at this point take on a strong didactic or pedagogical tone. This is why the emphasis is not just on describing how the world is and somehow meshing or merging with that intuition, but rather on building. She uses a German word Bildung in a variety of combined words, or educating subjects for making or manipulating objects and ideas that bear witness to the mysterious fact that the world is. Now Gego, in these Sabiduras, which do seem to have been written as guidelines to be distributed to the students in sort of what she calls the constructing architects, the construerende architecten. She speaks duty and discipline rather than simply imitation and reproduction. In Sabidura 3, for example, she writes, "It is not enough to show the architecture student reproductions of images or teach them the techniques used to reproduce them." In German, it's much more complicated because you get the repetition of Bild. It's not enough to give them the visual Erscheinungsbildes. He or she must also be able to construct an image for himself. Ein Vorstellungsbild zu haben und es aus sich selbst herausstellen zu können. Or again, and here I'm reminded with this strong emphasis on the need to discipline, to educate students into a certain autonomy and the capacity to construct a Vorstellungsbild for oneself, with the grammatically almost identical insistence that we find in the late Nietzsche, that when he writes, for example, "It is not enough to bring forth a doctrine. One must also violently or forcefully transform people so that they accept it." This is what Zarathustra finally understood. So the terms that Gego also uses in these didactic Sabiduras is quite forceful. It is about building, training, educating, forming, shaping. She uses words like the task or Aufgabe, probably better translated as task than as job, or the responsibility, the Verantwortung. Our job or task, she says, is to develop imaginative skills and individual judgments through a series of exercises very consciously designed for architect constructors, not for plastic artists. Those interested learn to integrate very diverse elements into a totality and to comprehend the laws of judicious limitations. Die Gesetze weiser Beschränkung. Here we have the wisdom that she is after in her Sabiduras, the hard-won wisdom that she is after. Or finally, still in the same Sabidura 3, by means of continuous comparisons through the public criticism of required projects and the presentation of works from different ages and from around the world, understanding and sensibility grow. In this case, knowledge, or Wissen, plays a very secondary role, and it is only from the practice of making things that one can develop creative confidence and the capacity for artistic judgment. In German, it's actually much more sophisticated. The last line, dabei kommt es nur bedingt auf Wissen an, nur das Selbstdoen führt zu schöpferischer Sicherheit und künstlerischer Urteilsfähigkeit. It's this self-tune, this self-doing or self-activity that appears here as crucial, well beyond the simple intuitive blending with the multiplicity of relations that many critics celebrate in Gego's work. And I think one of the lines that has been repeated in almost every presentation in the first roundtable is how important planning and control are on top of, or perhaps instead of, mere improvisation or freedom. In Sabidura 9, Gego points this out by drawing a clear distinction between training as being based or creating routines, manipulating instruments and material, versus education in the old sense of Bildung, which leads to consciousness or awareness through the manipulation of ideas. It is here, finally, where we enter into a minimal theory of the subject that is required in order to achieve the clarity that comes with adopting the perspective of formations and creations beyond what is visible on Earth, without ever breaking with the initial principle of immanence. Gego does not simply assert the subjective capacity for self-activity or self-tune as if it were a spontaneous fountain of energy. Instead, the subject, or I, Gego's ego, el ego de Gego, we could call it in a final form, appears only in the gap or incompleteness of the object. As she writes in Sabidura 2, which Nuit also quoted, before, each life is governed by origins and beginnings, by encounters and adjustments, leading to the present. Self-objectivity is impossible. When I start to analyze my past, I get lost in anecdotes that may be significant in terms of my own memory, but which are totally meaningless and redundant to appreciating my work. The past of all human beings is rooted inside every one of us. Again, all is in all. And if I have ended up with a certain combination of abilities to do what I do, it has been as the result of a multi-dimensional chess game. Un ajedrez multidimensional. I was thinking of el pan-ajedrez, el pan-juego of Sul Solari, which is a three-dimensional, infinite chess play. Here, instead of coming full circle, as we commonly say, a different understanding of the I, or subject, emerges in the gap that keeps the circle from ever being closed. Reason, as Verstand, can only ever try to dominate the space of life. And it is here, in the limits of reason's lordship or sovereignty, the Herrschaft of the strong leader or sovereign, the Herrscher, that the I, the Ich, seeks to educate or build its own mastery. What Gego proposes in their Sabiduras, in the words of its hard-fought wisdom, is then a form of clarity without control or of mastery without sovereignty, all based on a playful, do-it-yourself approach of self-tune or self-activity. Thank you very much.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on your definition of immanence as all there is relations in regards to Gego's work?
I mean, I see this as, in the few artist statements, she'll always say, there's nothing but lines in space, or lines in space. And whether you read it through the understanding of a rhizome and of multiplicity, or rather in terms of relationality, I think that there is a complete active forgetting about any form of transcendence. There is no sort of beyond. What you get.
Maybe the emphasis on making is also part of that.
But there is an emphasis on not just the being of the world as it is, it's also bringing out something that is not like the reality that we see or know. So where is the difference between the reality that is constructed in the work of art and the world as is, which is also an assemblage of relations? So we remain within an entirely sort of univocal view in which all there is in the world are relations and configurations or assemblages of networks of lines and relations. But there's still a minimal difference between reality as we know it, and the way modern science, for example, knows it, and the autonomous structure or assemblage that is being created through the work of art, and that requires the training and disciplining and controlling and planning that, without going beyond the world of relations, nonetheless involves a subject or an I, an Ich, in terms that depict or presuppose mastery without being a form of sort of lordship, lording it out over the world as it is. So but it's also not an intuitive grasp or fusion with, sort of the organic pantheistic notion of the world is a happy conglomeration of relations. And so I was trying to bring out that sliding within a world of pure relationality that nonetheless tries to introduce an autonomous kind of world, similar to what she does with the wordplay and the linguistic, almost poetic projection of the virtual axis and the jokes that produces when all of these possibilities are actualized. So it's a play between the actual and the virtual, for example, without ever breaking with the fact that everything is pure relation.
No, I'm thinking, the mastering throws me off a little bit, and I'm still not certain what this mastering of the space means, because we associate so much the notion of mastering with representation, which is the opposite of immanence, right? And you think of Heidegger's The Age of the World picture as precisely locating representation as that gesture of dominance over the world.
I think this is exactly when she says, we are not talking about that kind of representational control, which is here referred to as domination. Reason dominating the world, that is a question of Herrschaft or sovereignty. She's trying to delineate a mastery, a technical mastery. And maîtrise has a lot of, means a lot of things. A master in university level, it means you master a certain skill. Again, you're on the cusp between formations of knowledge at the university, technical skills in terms of design, and at the same time working with space that is not a question of the control of reason, but it is only because reason fails to control space. In that failure, the I, a different understanding of the ich in parentheses, is able to arise, which I think involves a form of mastery that is not sovereign, and therefore not representational, because it doesn't break with the immanence of pure relations.
I can't agree with that.
Sorry, I have just two questions. The first one is just very practical. These Sabiduras were distributed in printed form to her students at the university, or were they kept private to herself?
The Sabiduras were found after Gego passed away, when she left a bag with all these compiled, texts. Some were very fragmentary, some others were more complete. But she called the bag Sabiduras, so she designated that the whole collection as Sabiduras.
But some of them are in the edition. It is explained that in her teaching, Gego would like to begin a class, for example, by distributing, let's imagine, something similar to this, and have kind of a brainstorming session about...
So they were didactic notes.
They were didactic. Some of them were didactic.
But it's a sort of idea.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, the second question.
No.
I was kind of fascinated by your dichotomy or opposition between the Anaxagoras quote, all is within all, and the Aristotle quote, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And then your emphasis on Gego's idea of immanence not being transcendental. Where, in a way, you could say the all is within all and the whole is more than its parts are both transcendental ideas. Where does Gego fit within that? If that is an opposition, where would she fit?
I mean, the summary of the claim that I was making is that she fits in between, and that her work is situated, in between those two statements, because either there is a certain sort of homogeneous, almost pantheistic oneness, all is within all, and you can look at any element that in a sense contains the whole or the all. Each is all. Or there is some kind of gap. Even in mathematical set theory, you can say that the set of all subsets is always greater than the cardinality of the original set. And so there is a certain excess that is possibly beyond measure, that cannot be controlled. And so these statements, in fact, point in different directions. One more pantheistic, the other one focusing on the fact that if you try to structure any given set into parts, you're going to run into a problem of the excess of the whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. And so what I think she's doing, you can read it from the sort of ontological perspective that the world is nothing but relations, and somehow her works would lead into such a multiplicity. Or she's actually introducing small differences between the world as we know it, the way in which the world is known in science, for example, and the actuality, the Wirklichkeit that is produced in art, which is not simply in strict unity or fusion with pure relationality. There is an intervention here that works on that gap, which appears in the first statement. And so she moves constantly back and forth, I would say, between, in this case, the names, or the traditions named by Aristotle and Anaxagoras.
So would you say that she reverses Aristotle's statements? In the sense that she's interested in the line as the abstract creation of this relational idea of the world, and so that you could say that the essence of Gego's work is the part, and the whole is more unknown.
Well, it's interesting that when she says that the line as human means to express a relation between points, something that is entirely abstract in the sense of not existing materially in nature. So the assemblage of lines and relations that she creates, and it's not clear here whether she's talking about lines that the work of art creates, or lines as they exist, let's say, immaterially or incorporeally in reality, as part of the world as it is, or as part of being. But there's nonetheless a distinction drawn here between that which exists materially in nature, or what she elsewhere calls reality, and the entity that is being created in the work of art. And so it's not a question, I think, of inverting or choosing parts over whole, but rather of suggesting that not everything fits into everything else. It is not a homogeneous space of pantheistic unity, that there are gaps and breaches that are being introduced even by the simple introduction of a line, which is also a separation, as much as it is a connection. And that therefore the work of art opens up by using prefabricated elements, just as the poetic games in the almost poetic example that I compared to Vidovro, uses existing language, but by breaking it up and by introducing everything that is hidden into the virtual axis of selection, is now projected and introduced into the actual statement that we find on the page.
Yes, I was going back to geometry, and geometry is abstract in itself. The line is an abstract concept. But going back to this is very much like poetry when you see it. It has a kind of a surrealistic feeling to it. Do you think that she thought about it in that way?
Maybe not in these, because some of them are actually the result of the way they're printed in the book edition. And if you see, some of them have reproduction of the handwritten notes, which are just continuous. So even because of the conventions of typographical representation of poetry, we read this as poetry. But the one Sabidura that Nuit also studied, with all the neologisms, the ibits and idem and so on, that certainly, and I think quite consciously, is put on the page as part of a process that's similar to, let's say, un coup de dé in Mallarmé. And so I'm interested in the connections within a poetic tradition of working on language and the typographical reordering of information into a constellation or a network that is entirely intra-poetic, rather than, I'm not sure to what extent other factors play a role in that use of language and its redistribution into separate assemblages on the page that you can find, for example, in Mallarmé's Dice.
Another practical question. Do we know whether Gego had an extensive private library?
Yeah.
She did. Because, I mean, these sort of speak of constant reading and thinking that sort of inform these thoughts for her students.
But since, in a sense, I would be fascinated to read that. But since I'm like an aficionado, but not an expert, and so I was trying to suggest resonances or similarities within a poetic tradition or within a more philosophical set of reflections that are formalized. And I do think that genealogically there are interesting exchanges. Why is it that, let's say, the late Nietzsche or Wittgenstein write in this telegraphic style that might as well have been adopted from statements that we find in artists' notes, such as Mallarmé's Divagation, rather than it being the other way around.
Right, right.
And I'm interested in that moment where we have a fairly philosophical and terminologically very precise experimentation with the location of her art within a pedagogical, but also within, let's say, ontological space that coincides in time or in intention or in the project behind it with what we find in these formalized aphoristic exercises of certain philosophers or anti-philosophers.
But Gego's circle in Caracas was very much a circle of poets and writers. She was not interested in visual artists. I can say that. You know, I met Gego through writers, and she collaborated with Alfredo Silvestre, who was a very experimental and sophisticated writer, who even produced these transverbales, and he was playing with this kind of, structure as well. So I think it will be interesting to see, this kind of, aphoristic writing vis-a-vis what Silvestre was doing at the time. That will be a very interesting dialogue between the two of them.
And it goes all the way back. I mean, of course, we could trace it back to Joyce and the portmanteau words. We can trace it back to the figures that I mentioned. Vidobro, Sul-Solar would be another interesting case. Sul-Solar sort of invented languages, that come close to a form of Esperanto, which is also what you could read in the poem or the Sabidura that Luis was quoting before. That there is a certain universal Babeli confusion of languages, but it is being put to use by selecting and by structuring small units into larger constructions. And according to this principle, which I think is a fantastic insight into the functioning of poetry, why is that poetry projects this vertical axis of what's the paradigmatic choices are now almost literally, in the case of avant-garde poets, projected onto the horizontal line of what one actually finds on the page. And then it's almost as though Mallarmé and Gego go back and show you the verticality of this virtual world hidden behind the choice of any word. So now when you say Fortschritt, you almost have to hear constantly the actual presence of Fortschritt. And you can keep going with this type of sliding functioning of language, which is not simply, and this is the key, it's not that language is autonomous and that we have something that in deconstruction is called the free-flowing play of signifiers. It is still connected or hooked with these key rings onto language as we know it, but it reintroduces different combinations and assemblages so as to create a world within this world, one that does not break with pure relationality, but nonetheless points beyond reality as we perceive or know it.
Great. I think it's a good place to stop. We need to keep moving.